So, we begin at one of my happy places, Broadway. Broadway musicals. With the great legendary musical theater star, the trumpet-voiced Ethel Merman. So how many of us have ever heard Ethel Merman? Okay, some of us. Young ones who have not, you gotta look at her on YouTube. She's awesome. She was the star of classic musicals of the golden age of Broadway in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Anything Goes, Annie Get Your Gun, Call Me Madam, and Gypsy, among other things. Now I can just imagine a few of you, he's talking about Broadway. I thought this was about racial justice. Bear with me. Ethel Merman was famous for her work ethic. She was, as she would refer to her own self, I am a workhorse. She just threw herself 110% into whatever Broadway show, whatever television program, whatever film she was working on. She was known to be there early. She would stay late. She would work as hard as asked and then continue working. But she was also quirky. She would work and work and work and work and work, but there would come a point when in her mind, it was time to stop working on a show. Whether the composer felt the show was in final form, whether the book writer felt the show was in final form, whether the director felt the show was in final form, whether the producer felt the show was in final form, when Ethel Merman, because she was a star, decided the work was done, she would announce from the stage, "This show is frozen." This show is frozen, which meant there would be no other change, and it was time to open that show. Being frozen might be good for an Ethel Merman musical, but being frozen is not good for a religion. Yeah, let me hear it. Because if a religion is frozen, it means that somewhere somebody decided that this is it. This is everything captured with T, a capital T for truth. And this truth, this understanding, this perspective, this belief, this theology is going to be set from now until the end of time. I suggest to you that any religion that says it is frozen is a dangerous religion. You will hear Unitarian Universalists say many things, but you will never hear us say that this is a frozen religion. We say that we are a living tradition. Now, I know many of you have heard me talk about this, a living tradition. 2 words, it's really important, and let's look at the tradition part first. Unitarian Universalism just didn't come out because somebody decided to invent a religion that said, oh, let's have a religion where we love everybody and affirm everybody. And despite some popular misconceptions, Unitarian Universalism wasn't invented in the 60s when some Unitarian Universalists were smoking pot and, let's love everybody. Now, I do know that there were, as I've said, Unitarian Universalists smoking pot in the 60s, but I'm not going to say just pointed at herself, but Unitarian Universalists existed long before then. We trace our roots back over 2,000 years, back to ancient Judaism, and then to that really great, awesome, good Jewish boy named Jesus of Nazareth, who didn't come to create a new religion. He just tried to maybe teach people how to love a bit more inclusively and lovingly, and got knocked off for that. But we trace our roots we trace our roots all the way, and we're going to get to some more of those changes in a minute, but we are a tradition rooted in history. But we say we are a living tradition, which means it is alive, it is changing, it is responding to the calls of the moment, the calls of the time. It isn't frozen, it is living. And it is living because it is made up of living people who have questions, who are learning more about themselves, who are learning more about the culture that they live in. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe religion must grow, deepen, and change. A religion that remains frozen, a religion that remains unchanging, is a religion that is more of an artifact than a spirituality that is authentic for this time and place. Yeah, that's good. I want to share with you briefly 3 different times that Unitarian Universalism had the choice to remain frozen or to grow, deepen, and change. We ultimately did make the choice to live authentically into the moment, to continue being a living tradition, but only with great struggle and only with some mistakes. The first example was here in this country in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Out of what was a rather stodgy Unitarianism that was absolutely Bible-based, Jesus-centered, although Jesus was not a divine being, Jesus was a human being who came to teach us how to love and also raise a little ruckus by demanding for justice, but we were Bible-based. If you were in a Unitarian church in the 1840s, I would be preaching from the Bible. But then these amazing religious revolutionaries, and you've heard me talk about them before, the transcendentalists, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Emily Dickinson, so many others, they said it's fine to have those Bible stories. It's fine to have Jesus. He's a good dude. But there's so much more. First of all, you don't need old stories to have a relationship with the divine. You have your bodies, you have your minds, you have your senses. You can step outside right now in Fresno, feel the warmth of this summer day. You can look at the green of the trees. You can look at those flowers that are still blooming. It is a natural, beautiful world, and God, the divine, is alive in the natural world. You can perceive it with your senses. You don't need me to tell you that. You don't need a book to tell you that. You don't need Jesus to reveal that to you. You can have a personal one-on-one relationship with the divine. Mysticism, a natural mysticism. Well, let me tell you, this was spiritual religious TNT. It exploded Unitarianism. And the powers that be tried to crush it, to silence it, to just make it go away because it threatened the norm. But luckily, transcendentalists inspired other people and said, this religion, Unitarianism, must grow, deepen, or change. And so it did. It didn't take away the Jesus story, but it made room for more than the Jesus story. It made room for this natural mysticism. It made room for the study of other world religions. And it said you can find meaning in many different ways, but only when there was conflict. The second time that I'm going to share when this religion tried to stay frozen and was challenged to grow, deepen, or change happened in the 1970s into the early 80s. And some of you here were Unitarian or Universalists at that time. And this was a challenge that came from feminism. The Unitarians and the Universalists were 2 separate denominations that merged in 1961 to become the Unitarian Universalist Association. When they joined together, and you've heard me speak about this, they created a statement of shared purpose and principles to define what Unitarian Universalism would be for the 60s and beyond. And that statement of principles was ghastly, it was patriarchal, and it was devoid of vibrant spirituality. The women of Unitarian Universalism were unhappy with the sexist, lifeless language, and they became catalysts for change, a change that took 23 years to take place. And it took 23 years because there was significant opposition, mostly from male ministers and male lay leaders who liked that the denomination felt like an old boys club, a white old boys club, and a white straight old boys club. There was a battle to whether we were going to remain frozen or whether Unitarian Universalism was going to grow, deepen, or change. Warren R. Ross remembers and writes, much of the credit for starting the long and meandering path that led to the adoption of the reformulated 7 principles, and we're going to get to those in a minute, that we have today, must go to Unitarian Universalist women. Over many years, women, although not women alone, had been growing unhappy with this blatantly sexist language of the original principles, including a reference to the dignity of man. You may hiss that if you want. There you go. This was the 1970s, years when the U.S. women's movement was gathering momentum, though, and I'm so embarrassed about this, mentions of brotherhood and fellowship survived well into the 1980s in the language of Unitarian Universalism. You may hiss that as well if you want. Thank you. And so it was the women who pushed for a new statement of principles and said we need language that was inspiring and spiritually rich and not sterile and dry. So in 1977, the Women's UU Federation, Unitarian Universalist Federation, challenged the denomination to create new principles. They drafted a new version to present to congregations across the country. There was debate, there was more debate, and even more debate. And the question was asked, who would the Unitarian Universalists declare themselves to be for the future? In 1984, 7 new principles were adopted, thanks to the feminists who called us to grow, deepen, and change. Let's give it up for those powerful women. The third, and I'll be super quick, but it's important. This one also started to brew in the 1970s when some Unitarian Universalists tried to center the voices and experiences of the LGBTQ community within Unitarian Universalism. Some people began to use the language of inclusion for the LGBTQ community. There was fierce pushback from many Unitarian Universalists and many Unitarian Universalist congregations who said they wanted there to be traditional family values within Unitarian Universalism. Others said, yes, you can hiss there, that's okay. Others said, we affirm the LGBTQ community, but they didn't really do a good job about it, doing that because they didn't really understand who the LGBTQ community was, and they didn't get the time to actually learn who they were. They said they were welcoming, and they were good-intentioned straight folks but they sometimes acted as if LGBT people were prizes to be displayed. Oh, we have a gay couple in our congregation, how wonderful. Or they were exotics to be displayed. Truthfully, many LGBTQ people did not feel welcome in our congregations, and this intensified in the early 80s as the AIDS crisis exploded. Knowing this was not the denomination we wanted to be, in 1987, the Unitarian Universalist Association established a Common Vision Planning Committee. It was a diverse group of clergy and laity from around North America that was tasked with collecting information about how to welcome and accept the LGBTQ community. The UUA history recounts that they learned that the lived experience of LGBTQ people in Unitarian Universalist congregations spoke a painful truth. There were many negative attitudes, deep prejudices, and profound ignorance about LGBTQ people. And this was resulting in the exclusion of that community from our Unitarian Universalist congregations. This troubled many people who were committed to creating a truly inclusive faith tradition, and so a program was created called the Welcoming Congregation Program. It was a set of steps, a set of learnings, a set of workshops and activities, a set of standards that had to be met by mostly straight congregations so that they could truly say they were welcoming of LGBTQ people. For the most part, it worked, and because of that program, I, as a gay man, can serve this mostly straight congregation, and it is not a big deal. Now, the reason that these three major moments of change allowed us to end up on the right side of history and not the wrong side, and we could have ended up on the wrong side, is because Unitarian Universalism is, as I said, a living tradition. It's alive, it changes, and with struggle, it always grows, deepens, and changed. And that's because we don't have a creed, we have a covenant. And I know you've heard me talk on this, but just in case you haven't, a creed is a set of beliefs, usually that somebody else in the past figured out was true, and you now in the present have to sign on and say, okay, that's a set of beliefs I either can sign on to or I can pretend to sign on to, but it is about the way you're supposed to think to be part of a congregation, to be part of a faith tradition. We do not have a creed. We say we are a covenantal community. A covenant is a set of promises or aspirations that we make to each other, not about how we're going to think, but about how we want to be in relationship with each other, how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to treat those beyond the walls of this church, how we're going to treat the world. So we do not put our focus on trying to make everyone think the same way. Quite frankly, that would be utterly boring. We focus on inviting everyone to be in right relationship with one another and the world. As we often say, we need not think alike to love alike. And our focus is on the love. That's the covenant. So let's join together. Yeah. So let's join together our voices to remind each other of the covenant that was created by our 7 shared principles, a statement that was shaped in 1984 when feminists forced the denomination to grow, deepen, and change with a new, non-sexist, spiritually rich covenant. If you wish, you may join in. The 7 principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism. We covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Those are the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. They would appreciate our applause. Those 7 statements are the heart of Unitarian Universalism since 1984. But we are a living tradition, which means something created in 1984 should be able to evolve as needed to address new relevancies not even imagined in 1984. Recently, some Unitarian Universalists, especially Unitarian Universalists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, have been asking, are these enough? The answer for some is no. 155 Unitarian Universalist congregations in a grassroots effort have adopted a new 8th principle to address our majority white denomination's growing understanding of just how pernicious and deadly white supremacy culture is to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Before us is the question, do we, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno, California, want to become the 156th congregation out of 2,000 Unitarian Universalist congregations to adopt the eighth principle on a local level and force the issue to be addressed this June at the national level at our 2022 General Assembly in Portland, Oregon? This change in our principles, moving from being frozen to again being a living tradition, is being driven by individual congregations like ours if we so choose. The eighth principle specifically addresses, in no uncertain terms, an explicit call to become a Unitarian Universalist congregation and a Unitarian Universalist denomination that is truly inclusive, diverse, and anti-racist. It calls us to co-create a culture in our congregations that will allow us to be intentionally inclusive, diverse, and anti-racist. Would you say those four words with me, please? Intentionally inclusive, diverse, anti-racist. The draft language for the eighth principle that has emerged from the grassroots level is complex. It will most likely eventually be simplified, but at this stage in its grassroots development, there is complexity because it seeks to address all the varied ways anti-racist work in our denomination went awry in the past and failed. And folks, we can't afford to fail again. We can't afford to get it wrong again. These words want to set up a structure that will not allow failure once again. The eighth principle reads, we covenant, and there's that promise, that relationship at the heart of our faith. We covenant to affirm, which means I place my heart on it, but we're going to do more than just place our heart on it. We're going to promote it, which means we're going to work for it. So we covenant to affirm and promote journeying. And I said this when I introduced the principle back in March. I love this because it begins with movement. Journeying means we're going from one place toward another, but it is not a meandering journey because our next word is toward. So we are journeying towards something specific. And I love what we are moving towards. We are journeying towards spiritual wholeness. So at the heart of this eighth principle is spirituality, and it's spirituality, and it is about creating wholeness in ourselves, in our congregation, and in our denomination, and in society at large. We're going to find that spiritual wholeness by working. Remember our own mission statement, work for justice. We're going to work to build, which means we have to construct it. It doesn't exist. We don't know what it's going to look like. It will have to be something new. And what are we going to build? We're going to build a diverse. In Unitarian Universalism, diversity is seen as a strength. Sameness is not our goal. So we're going to work to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. Beloved community is a word from Dr. Martin Luther King that connects us back to the civil rights movement of the 60s and all of that amazing work that was done. The beloved community is not focused on individual wants and needs, but looks at the greater good of all. We are going to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. How? By our actions, which means we're going to do something, not just talk about it. And this is perhaps next the most important part of it, that accountably, which means there are going to be specific and measurable steps that will let us see whether this is being achieved or not. It's not going to be some pie-in-the-sky grandiose aspiration. We're going to be measured by it. We're going to be graded by it. That accountably dismantles racism, That's the anti-racist. But dear ones, we know that all isms are interconnected, so it will dismantle racism and other oppressions. It's lifting up the intersectionality of sexism, ableism, ageism, imperialism, capitalism, and so much more. We are going to dismantle this where? First, within ourselves. It begins inside each one of us. We make mistakes. I made a big mistake to Jamie, and I heard her pain, and I apologized because I needed to grow. So we first start within ourselves, and then by extension in our institutions, which means this congregation, which means our denomination. So we covenant to affirm and promote. Will you join with me in saying this 8th principle? Journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Once we make this declaration, we will begin the difficult and uncertain process of beginning to live into this vision. We don't know how. We don't know what it's going to look like exactly. We don't know what it's going to demand of us. We don't know the ways in the days ahead that we will be called to grow, deepen, and change. But we do know that, in the words of Angela Davis, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Think for a moment about yesterday's massacre of black people in Buffalo. A massacre fueled by white nationalist ideology, an ideology that is growing bolder, growing greater in numbers in this country. Think for a moment about what happened in that supermarket. We know that, in the words of a powerful and proud black woman, author, activist, and educator Rachel Cargle, anti-racism work is not self-improvement work for white people. It doesn't end when white people feel better about what they've done. It ends when black people are staying alive and black people have their liberation. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.